Okay, great. Hey everyone, welcome to our presentation. My name is Seth Shapiro. I am a senior consultant with Admissionado, and it is my privilege to be presenting to you today on I'm applying for my MBA in the next 3 months. What should I be doing? So this, I just want to say that this is one of our 3 sessions that are kind of gearing you towards the timeline for your MBA application. Now, we're geared mostly towards the 2021-2022 application season. So basically starting in the fall of this year or post-summer. But certainly if you're attending and you're looking to apply in subsequent years, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with getting a head start. You just may need to attend a refresher course, if you will, next year. So just keep that in mind. This is also part of one of our 3 series. So we've had a couple sessions before. I believe this is actually the 3rd of them. One is greater than 6 months out. One is 3 to 6 months, and this is obviously 3 months or fewer. So just wanted to kind of keep that in mind. And I believe that these sessions are recorded. So if you are interested in what you hear today and want to even possibly go back and see what was talked about in the past, that's obviously an option to you, though it may not be as relevant for those of you who are applying to round 1. Now, if you're applying to round 2, which typically happens around the beginning of January of next year, this would obviously be a little premature for you. So you should probably go back to the 3 to 6 month session. But I just want to kind of frame that for you and just give you a sense for what this presentation is all about. As far as our structure is concerned, I'm just going to take a few minutes to kind of go through some slides to walk you through the various components of the application and how you should be thinking about them fewer than 3 months out. But if you do have any questions, feel free to submit them via the chat, and then we will take them most likely in the order in which they come at the end of the presentation. I'm just going to be going through the slides uninterrupted. So without further ado, let us begin. Okay, so in terms of strategic positioning, right, this is basically going to be effectively the most important part of your application, even if it doesn't necessarily find its way into a particular component of the application that you submit. It's sort of weaved in throughout your application. So anytime the MBA is the MBA application process is kind of unique in a lot of ways because it is the MBA is one of those degrees, graduate degrees specifically, that most people tend to get after they have worked, obviously, for a certain number of years, saving aside for the deferred MBA programs. And so you're going to have to incorporate your work experience, and then you're obviously going to most likely be returning to the workforce after your MBA. So you have to have a story, right? A pre-MBA story and then a post-MBA story. And that's very different from other graduate degree programs such as law school, medical school, where you tend to go directly out of your undergraduate program to that degree and then start your career after. So it's a little bit different in that nature. I'm sure a lot of you who are listening now are sort of in the position where you are working a few years, you're looking at applying, so you already have that work experience, but just want you to keep that in mind. So when you think about the specific story, you need to kind of craft your narrative, right? You have to have a firm understanding of what you have done over, say, the last 2 to 5 years or however amount of time you have. Try and string that narrative together in a very clear and cohesive way. So you might have jumped to a couple different jobs. You may have had one job, but with many different promotions. It doesn't matter, right? You may even, by the way, have had just one job at one company. That's also perfectly fine. The admissions committee is not going to hold that against you or give someone an advantage just because of the way their career weaved or zigged and zagged, right? The point is you have to deliver that story to the admissions committee. And you have to say, this is what I have done since then. Here are my accomplishments. Here are notable highlights. Here are any promotions or changes that have been made so that they understand very clearly and very succinctly what it is you've done to date, okay? Now, One of the other things in terms of specifically as it relates to the MBA application is each school is obviously going to have its different essay prompts. They might ask you about your career to date, why you want an MBA, why you need an MBA, what you plan to do with an MBA after. They're all variations of kind of the same idea, which is, again, what have you done to date? Why are you getting an MBA? Why do you need this degree, and where are you going forward? So pay close attention to the specific prompts themselves, right? They're also going to have various different word counts. So you also want to keep that in mind, because what you can write in a 200-word essay is going to be very different from what you're expected to achieve in, say, a 650-word essay, or in the case of a few schools, such as Harvard Business School, no limit, right? You have to think about what it is that has been afforded to you in terms of word allotment, and then craft your narrative to that. So everyone is going to have to think about, and at some point, by the way, almost all of these essays, they do want to kind of talk about your story. So think again about who it is you are, and what your work experience has been today. Whether you work with an MBA consultant such as us at Admissionado, or you decide to kind of go at this on your own, it's very, very helpful to kind of practice rehearsing your narrative, right? Explaining what your position is. Really kind of get it vetted by at least a couple people to make sure that it makes sense and that it's interesting and it's clear, right? Everything kind of has to work. You need to know this narrative like the back of your hand, as they say, because it's going to come clear in your essays. And then, if you get an interview at any of these programs, you're going to have to then effectively repeat that. So, you should know this story very, very cold. And I kind of talk a little bit in the beginning about the pre-MBA, but again, the same thing goes for your post-MBA. You have to have a very, very clear understanding of what your short-term and your long-term goals are. Now, bear in mind, some of these essay prompts, as I kind of talked about as it relates to the first bullet on this slide, are going to be very specific in terms of what is it that you want to do immediately post-MBA, for example, or they might ask what are your short and long-term goals, or they may just ask about your long-term goals. Make sure you're answering the prompt based on what it is asking, not what it is that you want to ask, right? And a way to get automatically dinged is to just write the story that you want to write, not what the question is asking. And that might be frustrating because you may have had prepared all of these essays and stories that you want to share with each school, but each one is going to be different. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so test taking is a hot topic. It's a particularly challenging one for some people. But just so everyone's totally clear, for MBA programs, you are going to have to submit either the GMAT or the GRE. Now, I understand this year is a little bit different when it comes to sort of test optional matters because of the pandemic and test availability dates. But I'm going to kind of just speak to this for a normal year, and if your school is requiring it, then obviously you should follow suit. If not, then this may not be nearly as relevant. Okay, so most schools, or almost every single school, is going to require the GMAT or the GRE. You're able to submit both. There's no problem with it. Most schools tend to take the highest score, even if you've taken it a few times. There are some schools that might consider a super score, which is where they'll take the highest component of each exam, but most tend not to do that. So just look at it as sort of the highest of your test date. So when you actually sit down and take it. But this is the time really to kind of wrap this part of the process up. So if you're looking to apply for round one, which will occur around October 1st, some are a couple weeks earlier, some are a few weeks after, this is when you really kind of got to nail it down, right? So if you haven't already started studying, grab a book, sign up for a course, get a tutor, whatever makes the most sense for you, and get cracking. Also, you should sign up for a test date, because availability has been pretty thin lately. And if you haven't taken the exam yet, I strongly urge you to actually take it, or think about taking it twice. Again, goes back to my point about the schools counting the highest test score, and also psychologically, and this is what I advise to a lot of my clients, is if you know you're taking the exam twice, the first chance is almost a little bit of sort of like I have nothing to lose sort of situation. If you do really well, great, the process could be over. If you do really well or do decently, you've banked the score and you could always take it a second time and potentially do better without really running any risk to yourself. And if you don't do well, you've got another shot at it. It just kind of takes the pressure off. So just something to consider. As far as the split between the GMAT and the GRE is concerned, this is obviously another hot topic. I would say if you're really unsure, the general rule of thumb is if you're stronger in math, you typically take the GMAT because the math is more difficult, but there's a more favorable curve. And if you're more favorable in terms of vocabulary and the verbal side of things, maybe go for the GRE because the math is a little bit easier. And if you're really stuck and you have no idea and you think you're kind of the best of both worlds, take a diagnostic for both and do that soon. This way you kind of see where you stand relative to one another. But if you are trying to take the exam now, I would say pick one after you've done some self-assessment and kind of go down that path, right, rather than trying to prepare both at the same time. If you've done this exam, great, you're all done. But the other thing to note is that you can technically submit an exam as long as it was taken the day the deadline or the day of the deadline. You can always submit it later. It's not an issue because it usually takes a few days for the schools to get ramped up in terms of getting the files in order and organizing themselves in terms of how they're going to review things. But I wouldn't leave it to the last possible date because you never know. There could be an issue with the test center. You might not feel well. So I would say, try and get it done as soon as possible without sacrificing, your ability to score well. Another big component of the MBA application are the letters of recommendation. Most schools tend to ask for 2. And the general consensus or the preference for the most part is it's usually someone who's had a supervisory or managerial role over you. Now, that's obviously not going to be possible for a lot of people for whom they are concerned about telling their recommenders that they're leaving. Maybe the company itself is not really gung-ho about their people leaving to get an MBA or a graduate degree of sorts. I get that. I've seen every situation. That's okay. Ideally, you want to pick people. The most important criteria are 1, is this someone who knows you well? And 2, is this someone you can trust? Because with respect to the latter, these are people who are going to have to spend a good chunk of their own time writing a letter on your behalf without really getting much out of it. Obviously, they want to see you do well, but this is something that they have to do in their spare time while juggling maybe family time and their own work responsibilities. And so you really do want to be going or selecting people who well and who you can trust to deliver. I've heard of horror stories where recommenders are fine, right, or potential recommenders are totally fine to sign up and support someone to write these letters, but then when it comes down to the deadline, they rush them or they don't even get them in time. So just be super careful about that. And that kind of speaks actually to the last point on this slide, which is, make sure you're staying in touch with your recommenders. As far as a calendar is concerned, I actually think it's best if you sort of talk to them about 2 months before the deadline. We kind of feel like that's sort of the sweet spot. I mean, if you're looking at round 2 and you're listening to this presentation, you can obviously get in touch with your recommenders now, but just bear in mind, if you were to get a deadline that far in advance, and again, we're looking at the beginning of January, would you remember that? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on your personality. So 2 months is kind of a nice amount of time. The other thing too is that, most of these recommenders are not going to be spending 2 months working on them. They're probably going to spend a day, a few days, depending on how many they have to do. But it's nice to give them the luxury of time so that if they need to work their schedule or they have to do it a week before they were planning to or before the deadline, that's fine. You just want to give them flexibility as a courtesy. Another good practice that I have suggested to a lot of my clients and has actually been received very favorably is to sort of prepare what is written here in the second bullet as sort of a written memo or a briefing, some sort of packet, if you will, just to kind of give them some material so that they can be reminded about what it is, what projects you've worked on with them, but also to give them specific information about the schools and the processes that you are going through. So you might want to list, the schools you're applying to for the rounds, give them specifically the deadlines, give them the questions. Most of the questions tend to be the same, but it's nice if they have them in advance rather than when they get them, when they sign up via email and sort of a separate process. And so all the information you can give to your recommenders in advance is super helpful for them, and it just facilitates the process really easily. You may also, by the way, want to attach a resume if you feel comfortable, and most importantly, just open yourself up to questions so that they can clarify, anything you've worked on together, or ask you questions about the process itself. Right? You need to kind of deliver for them, and rather than have them fish. Again, just making it super easy because it is a big ask. By the way, a lot of recommenders also may not use the information you give them, but it's helpful as far as just prodding their minds and kind of giving them a flavor for, again, what it is that think makes you special, and captures the general nature of the working relationship between the two of you. So again, most importantly, pick the right people, give them the information, and stay on top of them. There's no shame in following up. At the end of the day, this is your future. This is your process. And you want to make sure that you're actively managing it. It's a good experience in management as well, too. The resume is a fairly straightforward part of this process. Different schools have different formats, but the lion's share of programs are going to want it in one page, right? So some international programs might be a little bit different. I know that some graduate schools, especially those that are research heavy, have more CVs, which tend to have a lot of research and other things, but the MBA application is one page. You'll usually find the instructions on the admissions committee websites of the various schools you're applying to, but rule of thumb is one page, get it all. Don't be obnoxious in terms of margins. Just make it look very, very presentable, right? Content is obviously more important, but style is too, because how you read a resume and the manner in which it's presented is going to matter a lot in terms of how the content is absorbed. So again, if you're using an MBA admissions consultant, obviously that person will be reviewing the resume and kind of crafting it in a way that is best reflective of your experiences and your proudest accomplishments. But if you're not, it's very good to kind of get feedback from people you trust, specifically maybe MBA alumni or current students who are happy to give it a couple looks, because they tend to know, how these things should read. And so it's just very, very good feedback to give it to someone who maybe is not from your industry or someone who is as well, just so they understand, having looked at a resume for the first time, what it is that you're trying to convey. Remember, the admissions committee people, they're going to look at your resume once, maybe twice. And so everything needs to be really, really clear about what it is you've done and what your skills are, and how, what your overall story is, right? The resume sort of complements, or the essay sort of complement the resume, depending on which way you look at it. So this is kind of your best effort to kind of put your professional summary on one sheet of paper. The same thing goes, as I talked about in a previous slide, about rehearsing your narrative so that it's good for interview prep. The same goes for the resume. In a lot of cases for MBA interviews, the resume is all that the interviewer, who is maybe a second-year student or an alumnus, will have. Some schools like NYU and HBS will actually have read your entire application, including the essays and letters of recommendation, but most tend not to have that information. It might be a resume, it might be just a short bio. And so practicing reading your resume, knowing every line item, every word like the back of your hand, is going to be super important for the interview process as well. But certainly you'll cross that bridge when you come to it. But again, once you get it on paper, that's what you're selling. So make sure it's what you're proud of. So, the big topic are the essays, right? And I tend to find that is obviously where most people tend to spend most of their work, because a resume is going to be done one and done, and it's going to be, for all schools. I rarely see people who do multiple versions for different schools. It's just not really done, because it's hard to truly change the narrative entirely, and nor do you really need to. But that's where essays come in, because this is going to be where you spend, I'd say, 75 to 80% of your time. So it's important to make sure you allocate that time to, assuming you'll go through multiple drafts. At Admissionado, we typically look at anywhere from 3 to 6 drafts, with 4 to 5 kind of being the sweet spot. But that's our process. Every consultancy is different, and every individual is different in terms of how many revisions and drafts that they like to do. So if you're working with a consultant, they'll have their process, but Similar to the strategic positioning and the resume. If you're going to rely on friends or colleagues, make sure it's people that you trust, who you think have a good eye for this sort of work. At the end of the day, these essays really are a way for you to breathe light into your best accomplishments. And those may be things listed on your resume, they may not be, but this is going to be your opportunity to really differentiate yourself. The resume is going to be important, but this is how your personality comes through in your application. So you want to take these very, very seriously, and you want to almost get started relatively soon if you're looking at round one. Now, that depends on how many schools you're applying to. If you are applying to, say, a couple, and you don't have a terribly busy work week, or work schedule, that's fine. You can probably take your time within reason. If you're looking to apply to 4, 5, even 6 schools, which is, by the way, on the higher end for a given round, then you obviously should get started now, especially since most of the questions have been released. These things tend to take a lot of time, and you want to be able to be methodical about it, so you're not writing them in one night or a couple of days. You want to write them, maybe take a day, let it digest, think about how it's sounding. Maybe new ideas will come to you. Obviously, if you're working with people, they need time to review the essays. So just keep that in mind, and maybe if it's helpful, put together a calendar of when you want to get these essays done and how much time you think you'll need to spend, always bearing in mind that it takes longer than you anticipate. At Admissionado, one of the first things I do with my clients is put together a calendar, knowing, again, on average, how long it takes to put together these applications, specifically these essays, and then add in a little buffer time, knowing that things pop up. And right now we're obviously in the middle of the summer for most people, and so it can be a little bit slower in terms of pace of business, and just general efficiency, if you will. The last point I'll mention, and this is the third bullet point here, is if you're not a native English speaker, you do need to make sure that you get these essays vetted. This is a concern for a lot of admissions committees who are considering international applicants. They'll obviously have the TOEFL and other sorts of the verbal side of the GMAT or the GRE to kind of indicate your strength on the English side. But one of the biggest red flags is if your essays are not don't sound right, or they don't have proper grammar. So if you're not a native English speaker, it's very, very important to make sure that you get them reviewed by people who can help you out in that regard. Great. So that's actually all that we have. I told you it would be relatively quick. I'm going to basically stop sharing my screen and move it over to questions so that you all can ask away. I would ask that try to keep your questions brief. I'm happy to answer things that are somewhat personal in nature, but if you really are digging into something very, very profile specific, or it's probably best to either post on GMAT Club. Admissionado, we have our own page under the profile. I think they just changed the name. I think it's Profile Reviews by Expert or something like that. Or certainly at Admissionado, go to our website and sign up for a free consultation. That's a really good opportunity for you to get connected with one of our consultants. Maybe there's a particular person you like, or a set of interests, or a profile that really matches with yours. And that is a great opportunity to talk with that person about your background, about your situation, how to plan for the next 3 months, or for round 1, or if you're looking at round 2, the next 6 months. And then obviously for us to kind of walk you through, how our services can be additive to your chances of getting in. So with that said, I'm going to pause and see what questions there are. Oh, okay, great. So we have a question here that says, any suggestions or feedbacks about the 1-minute video that some schools such as MIT require? Okay, great question. That is one of the trickier applications, because they don't they actually follow sort of their own format, sort of, march to the beat of their own drum, as they say. They have, just in case people are not familiar, they have 3 primary components. One is an organization chart, which is not terribly challenging. It's more straightforward. The second bit is a cover letter of I want to say it's 350 words, but don't hold me to that. And then, as this person indicated, a 1-minute video. So the way I look at it is that the cover letter is effectively giving the AdCom a quick summary of your background, what you've accomplished, then talking about where you're going professionally and why MIT Sloan would be a good fit. Obviously, you can reverse the order depending on stylistically what makes sense for your presentation, but that's kind of the key strategy. And so the question is, well, what do you do with the 1-minute video? To me, that's a great opportunity to introduce kind of the more personal elements of your background. So if you have a couple of extracurricular activities or leadership accomplishments or fun facts about yourself, that's a great way to present. And then potentially tie it into things that you might take place in Cambridge, in Boston, at MIT Sloan in particular. And just in general to kind of make it a little bit more lighthearted. You can get creative with the format and other sorts of things like that. But a minute goes by very, very quickly. And so, for me, it's the best way to kind of show the creative side of yourself and introduce the sort of X factors, right? The je ne sais quoi that you think will sort of sell your own profile relative certainly to the competition. I believe Georgetown McDonough also does a video. And so again, same kind of idea. Just think about it relative to what else they're asking in terms of essays and other sorts of requirements, and feel like, hey, what am I missing, and how can I best present that through this mechanism? Okay, great. So we have a question here. If we are on a budget and are interested in hourly consulting services, what would be the most advantageous point in the application to use 1 to 3 hours of consulting time, budget packages? Okay, so I'll speak from the Admissionado perspective because that's all I know. So the best way you might want to look at it is if you're going to do sort of 1 to 3 hours, you can, I would say maybe kind of break it up almost through the process itself. So maybe, for us, you can set how much time you want to engage with the person and at what points you want to do. So let's just say it were me, I would say book 30 minutes in the beginning so you and I can talk about your background and strategic positioning and maybe a calendar and a list of schools. I can be very efficient, and I believe my colleagues are as well. Then I would use sort of the next 2 hours or so to break it up in 30-minute buckets to maybe have either specific essays you're struggling with or overall application reviews. Those can take anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes, depending on the person. That might be a good way to kind of get general feedback from a professional. And then the last 30 minutes could be used for maybe interview prep, right? Do a 15, 20-minute interview and then, 5 to 10 minutes of feedback. That would be a great way to kind of almost simulate the full package experience without having to obviously spend the money for it. So that's something you could do. You could obviously also use the time just to do essay reviews. I've done that with people as well. So think about where you're struggling, where you think you need the most help, and where you can't get it elsewhere. And I would book the time with the consultant that way. Okay, the next question says, in the case of applying for strategic management, do we need our profile or should match in terms of strategic planning work? No, it doesn't have to. I mean, look, the argument to getting an MBA for a lot of people is you're trying to make a career change or a pivot of sorts. So if you have some exposure or experience directly in the field you want to go into or you want to study, such as strategic planning or strategic management, great, you can speak to that. And, that would be an argument as to, why you like it since you've sort of experienced it firsthand. You obviously would then have to make the argument as to why an MBA would best complement that or move you to the next level, so to speak. But if you don't have that experience, you just have to make the argument how you would get that in the MBA, including the internship. So it's all just dependent. For the most part, there are no requirements as far as wanting to study something at a given business school. Now, if you were to go into a field where there are known requirements, such as like private equity, where you have to have, for the most part, pre-MBA experience, then maybe I wouldn't suggest doing that. But based on this question here, I think you should be totally fine with or without the experience. This person asked any suggestions for the HEC Paris presentation interview. I have to admit, I'm not that familiar with it. And I'm sorry, I don't want to mislead you. So what I'd suggest is reach out to us via GMAT Club, and I can certainly find out from a consultant who spend their time focused on European schools and specifically HEC Paris. The question reads, is it possible for recommenders to take back or change their recommendations once the application has been submitted? Do B schools allow this? So I saw this actually in a forum earlier. I think it's probably the same question. I'm actually not sure. My guess is probably not, just because these processes tend to be very forward in a lot of ways, right? There's sort of a point of no return. I would just call a couple of schools, maybe ones that you're looking at applying to, and ask them. You can call them and be anonymous, so it's not like there's any downside to that, and they would certainly be able to answer that specifically from how they run their systems and process. Any tips on how to approach recommenders for multiple letters of recommendation for multiple applications, particularly when there are more than 4 applications? Yes, this is kind of what I was hinting at earlier, which is this is an enormous ask. In some respects, it's almost like the recommenders themselves are applying to business school, right? Because of how much effort is there. Now, the good thing is that a lot of the top schools use the same questions in the past, and I believe it's the case this year. The first question is usually, how does this candidate compare to the peer set? And the second question is about a piece of constructive feedback that you've given the candidate. And then an optional third question about, like, is there anything else we should know, which is, again, just optional. It's not required. So the schools obviously have coordinated so that it cuts down on the amount of work that applicants or the recommenders have to do. My suggestion to managing this is, first, give them as much time as possible. So maybe 2 months is not enough time and 3 months is. At the end of the day, if you give someone a large amount of time and they choose to do it in the last week, yes, technically that falls on you, but you can't fault yourself for not at least giving them the opportunity to space it out. 2, give them all the questions and everything in advance, like I said, in the briefing packet, so that they know what they can expect. 3, don't write the letters yourself. I know that's a common practice, but it's very obvious when someone's voice comes through, and frankly, you can kind of see what material they bring in versus, or what you would bring in versus what the recommender would bring in. It's readily apparent, and I see this across many applications. 4, acknowledge, what a huge burden this is and how grateful you are. Obviously, I'm not recommending you buy gifts, but a token of appreciation is not such a terrible thing. And lastly, just bear in mind their work schedule and any sorts of events in the calendar. This is actually more relevant for round 2, because the applications, as I mentioned, come right after the holidays, and a lot of people will obviously take some time off. And so, making them aware of the calendar and making yourself available to them even during that stretch, or certainly trying to push to completion before that, would be, I think, a long way to doing that. So yeah, it's a tough matter. I get this question a lot. There's no way around it. The only other thing you could possibly do if a recommender, by the way, says they can't do 4+ applications, is find a backup just in case. Any suggestions for a dual degree in MBA JD program, especially considering the fact that the 2 schools care more about different aspects of an application? It's kind of out of scope in terms of this presentation, but I'll answer it anyways. You need to basically show that you're qualified to do both degrees, right? So you're going to have to do both applications. There might be a joint essay, but I believe almost every school, you have to get into that particular MBA and JD program independently of one another. So, the good thing is, at least in this particular case, they're kind of separate. So, the JD is going to ask you for the personal statement. The MBA is going to have very specific questions related to the MBA. You can certainly reference wanting to do a JD if you're for the MBA part, and vice versa. But just bear in mind if one school doesn't accept you can't do the joint program. So you might want to hedge a little bit. But for the most part, when they're evaluating candidates, They're looking at people who have strong test scores, good GPA. If you have work experience, obviously that should be of high caliber. And beyond that, it's all about, specifically gearing the applications towards a specific school. Okay, if I'm applying to 4 schools and I'm starting with round 2, then do I split some to round 3 or apply all in round 2? What should be a good strategy? So the nomenclature is a little different. I'm going to assume that you mean sort of round 2 as in relative to the 3-round process. Some schools actually technically have 4, like Cornell or NYU. They have usually it's an October, a November, a January, and then like a spring, which is March maybe deadline. So they have 4 rounds. The translation to that is actually like the October, November deadlines are sort of the round 1, and then the January is kind of the round 2 for other schools, and then round 3 and so forth. I would actually not recommend applying in round 3, just because this is the rates of admission really fall off pretty drastically. I think the statistic is somewhere like 90% of the class is filled after the first 2 rounds. And so you don't really want to be putting yourself in a position where there are fewer seats and the competition may be equally as difficult. So I would, if you're talking about the traditional 1, 2, 3 rounds, I'd say do them all in round 2. Assuming that's a January deadline, you should have ample time to do that for 4 schools. Okay, do we have any other questions? We have a question here. Which do you apply? Which round? I guess. Oh, apply in which schools for entrepreneur backgrounds? That's. I don't have a particular response to that. I mean, you should. A lot of the programs these days are geared towards studies in entrepreneurship. That's obviously been a big trend. So even a school like Wharton, for example, which is known to be a finance powerhouse, has actually made great strides in offering an entrepreneurial course. In fact, they actually have a San Francisco campus. The bigger thing for that is just look at the particular schools, do some research, and see what courses they're offering, what clubs they have. Are they located in cities where you might want to work or network with the local entrepreneurial community, and just go from it there. That's kind of fairly, I think, commonsensical. Great. So we have a question here. How many essay drafts have you seen people make before attaining a final version? So it depends what you consider to be an essay draft. There are, some people they change 2 words and they consider it a new draft. So obviously I wouldn't necessarily count that in terms of how I'm responding to your question. Again, I will use Admissionado as a good reference. I have seen, we typically do around 4 versions, maybe 5, especially if it's an earlier school. I've seen people go up to 8. A lot of times that would be the case if someone, after a couple of rounds, had a change of heart or needed to pivot their entire story, and it was better to undo the work or start from fresh rather than proceed down their rabbit hole. But I've also seen people, especially who have worked on multiple schools with me, maybe do 2 versions or 3 versions, especially if it's the 3rd or 4th school that they're applying to. And the reason being is that you get a good repetition in terms of the questions and prompts. As I mentioned earlier, the prompts will all be different in terms of the nuance of the question they're asking and the word length and sort of maybe it's school specific, so there's 3 dimensions you have to factor in. But at a certain point, you don't want to be changing your narrative too much. So for example, if you told me you wanted to go into management consulting after school and then eventually become the CEO of a retail company, how drastically are you going to change that? You probably don't need to. You can point out certain things at a given school that would allow you to do that. Say at Wharton, or if you were applying to Stanford, maybe that's another way you can touch base on things based on a particular club or course that you think is relevant. But stick to the schedule, because if you're looking at 3 months out, you want to be reinventing the wheel every single time you write an essay. Then you're going to start to fall behind. This is all sort of about being efficient and genuine at the same time. The question is, will October be too late for starting with essay preparation for round one? Will 1 month be enough with proper guidance? Yes, I don't know why you'd have to wait. If you're here now and you're thinking about it, I mean, maybe you have things going on at work or in your personal life. I would get started now. I have this is an extreme example, and I don't really recommend it to people. I have done an application with someone in 4 days. It was rushy. It was not what I had wanted. It came with premium turnaround, but it can be done. I've also known people who've done an application in 36 hours. So anything is really possible. The quality obviously wasn't as good because there was, we would prefer to have had more time to kind of think through things. We kind of had to just go down sort of with tunnel vision. So if you're looking at, an October start to apply, say November, if that's what you're looking at, then yes, that would be late. I would say, start if it's, middle of July or 2/3 of the way through July. I'd say try and start no later than August. Again, depending on how many schools you're looking at. If you're looking at one school, that would be fine. If you're looking at few, you probably want to get started as early as possible, bearing in mind the timeline that I laid out earlier. How many schools do most people eye? Also, how much time does one school application might need? This is very, very person to person. There are multiple considerations that people come to me with when they think about how many schools. I know people who, on one hand, who say, I want to go to business school. I have to go to business school this year. I don't want to take any chances. And so they apply to a lot more schools. I've worked with people on 6 schools for one round. Now, that was someone who started very early and pretty much was head down throughout that entire summer to the early deadlines, but he got them all done. And he kind of applied to a mix of like target and reach schools. I've also had people who have said, look, I'm only going to go to these 2 or 3 schools. That's all I'm going to apply to. And if I don't get in, then I'm just not going to go, or I'm going to think about alternate plans. And so they think about that. So that's fine. And then in terms of the timing, I answered this before. It really depends on the individual. But Admissionado, we look at around 4 weeks for the 4 to 5 weeks of the first school, 3 to 4 for the second. Anywhere between 1 and 3 for subsequent schools. Again, depending on how quickly you turn around information and whether you work on things simultaneously or not. We have a question here. Does it make any sense, or does it ever make sense to apply to 8 to 10 schools? I don't know how you could pull that off in one round. Now, if you're applying to 8 to 10 over the course of 2 rounds, so that would be, 4 to 5 per round, or maybe 6 and 4, or some variation thereof. Yeah, that's fine. I've seen people do it. In fact, they break it up in a few different ways. You can take the approach where you apply to your hardest schools in round 1, see how you do, or at least, see how the interviews come in, because that's an early sign of whether, you're a fit or not. And then based on that return, prepare the other applications for round 2. And, almost like sort of, tier 1, tier 2. I've also seen people who have done a combination where they apply to like a mix of schools in terms of difficulty in round 1. Maybe they get into a safety or a target and they're done. Maybe they're not. And they hold on to that acceptance and then apply in round 2 to other places. So, yeah, so it is possible, but definitely not in one round. So the question reads, between rounds 1 and 2, are there any telling statistics on probability of selection for an overrepresented group like an Indian male? In other words, in applying round 1 way better than round 2. So this question gets asked a lot. There's no truth out there as to whether this is the case. The general thumb is no. My belief is that it does not make a difference which round. I've gotten people who come from overrepresented backgrounds in round 2. It's not an issue. So I would not be concerned about that. The one thing I would be concerned is if you are coming from international background, you should try and apply to the earlier rounds. So I think 2 would be fine, because there's visa processing issues and all that. Later rounds make it somewhat difficult. And the other matter is, if you're looking for scholarships, they tend to be a little bit more favorable in round 1, because just how a lot of the schools do, they disproportionately more money out than in subsequent rounds, but there is still scholarship money available in later rounds. So you're not at a disadvantage. And the general, also, I keep saying rule of thumb, but the general rule of thumb here is that apply in the round that makes sense for you. I'd rather see someone put together a strong, well thought out, carefully vetted application in round 2 than rush one in round 1. To me, any perceived advantage of round 1, of which I happen to think there's none, is going to be undone through the rushy nature of it. The question is, as an applicant in their mid-30s, is it best to justify why I'm seeking to do an MBA on the third optional essay? Based on your experience in consultation, how do people like me deal with this issue? So the answer is no. That's not what the optional essay is for. The optional essay is really for truly extenuating circumstances, such as the reason a GPA might be low. Maybe there was an issue with the GMAT on the one day you took it. Maybe there's something in your personal life that needs to be brought to bear. There's a huge range of reasons. Being an older candidate is not that, right? That comes in sort of the why do you need an MBA? What is your career? How's your been career? Well, how do you describe your career to date? Where are you going after this? You kind of have to bake in that assumption to say, listen, I have all of this great experience. And an MBA makes sense because I need to get, without it, I will not get to that next level or wherever I'm trying to go after it. So that's the best way to kind of deal with the issue. It's sort of, you can't really unscramble an egg. You may just want to think about how the schools you're selecting for your list and go for schools that tend to be more favorable for people, for older candidates. The other thing too is if you're in your mid-30s, you might actually want to consider a part-time or an executive MBA program instead. I think that might make more sense. Now, obviously, it's a different experience entirely, and it's less geared for people who are trying to change careers. But your odds of getting accepted will be significantly higher than the full-time MBA program. 30 is kind of that seesaw age, and while I know plenty of people in their early 30s who get in, once you kind of get closer to 35, it tends to be significantly difficult, and I think you kind of need to reassess where you might be. This is a good question. Is it advisable to start preparing for applications without the GMAT or GRE score? If you're applying to round 1, yes, I think you have to get the ball rolling for all the reasons I mentioned. The caveat to that is, well, what schools will you be preparing for, right? And what confidence level do you have in scoring the necessary, or getting the necessary exam score you need to qualify for those schools? So if you're struggling with the GMAT, let's just say, for example, you want to apply to a Harvard or a Stanford, and you're not really cracking that 700 or not even getting close to 730 or whatever it is that you feel is, appropriate for your background, then you might want to not prepare those applications, because if you don't get the score, all the work you put in might be effectively rendered useless because you could be theoretically filtered out before they even read the essays. If you do have confidence that you can get those scores because your practice exams are there and you're generally a good test taker, or whatever confidence you have in that, then yeah, fine, go ahead and do it. The one caveat to that is, are you comfortable splitting time, right? You obviously need to be doing the application work and potentially preparing for the exams. If that's the case, just think about how many schools you can do in one given round. In your case, maybe you want to focus on the GMAT and then get an early start for round 2, even while round 1 deadlines are approaching, just so you give yourself more of a window of opportunity. Say you, instead of 3 months to prepare for round 2 applications, you give yourself 4, but you've done well in the GMAT or the GRE. Just food for thought. Is it necessary to have recommenders in different areas or companies? No, not necessarily. You can have people, and not everyone has that luxury. You could. I think again, the key thing here is: do you find people you trust and who know you well and who can deliver? I do happen to think that it's important to have people who can maybe introduce different elements of your background or different experiences. You don't want the recommenders to be redundant in their content. But let's just say you were at GE, right? And you worked in the lighting business, and then you worked in the airplanes business. I mean, I don't know who would do that, but That could make sense because you'd have two different people, two different recommenders talking about completely different sectors, and that could speak favorably to your ability to have an impact across a given organization. But no, it's definitely not necessary. Depending if they're at the same company, and the recommenders know one another, you could try and have them coordinate if you felt comfortable and that made sense. But no, I would actually think also too that you could have people talk. Let's say you change jobs, right, or change companies. You could have someone from your first job and say your second job, there's no problem with that. Just bear in mind you're probably a stronger professional in your second job because you've accrued experience and theoretically you've become a wiser, more seasoned professional. So that might look more favorably in terms of what someone sees in you, but that's not entirely necessary. But actually that brings up one good point, which I forgot to mention earlier, which is I would not, in selecting your recommenders, I would not fixate on people who have a certain title. If you happen to be close with the CFO of your company and you feel, again, they meet the criteria of trust and ability to deliver, then by all means, reach out to them. But it's more important to get those first criteria than someone who's high up, because at the end of the day, their title matters less than your qualifications. This question is, should you reapply to the schools you couldn't make it into the first attempt, say a year ago? How should you go about this? Absolutely. I mean, there's no problem with reapplications. I work with reapplicants all the time. It's common, and look, especially given this past year where the acceptance rates were abnormal in how low they were, just given the pandemic and deferrals and all other contributing factors. So you're going to probably see, I think, more reapplicants this year than you have in past years. So I think it will still be competitive, but not quite as competitive as last year. Just kind of a slight digression there. I do think that it can be challenging if you're applying from a later round in the previous season and then going for an earlier round in the current or upcoming season. So, for example, if you were round 2, round 3 for the 2020-2021 season, and you're applying to round 1 in the 2021-2022 season, that might be difficult because one of the key things you have to consider is or the schools consider is how much change has happened since then. Like, what has been your progress? What new information are you introducing to the table? And that really isn't that much time, right? If you don't find out till March, April, and then you're applying in September, maybe you got a promotion, maybe you did something new, change jobs, fine. But even if you change jobs, how much time have you had on that job? So I'm comfortable doing all of that, but I would say 12 months, or one round to the next round is usually your safe bet because you tend to see more progress there. Great. Question is, what are some pointers that we can ask recommenders to write on our recommendation letter? What are the schools looking for in their recommendation letters? So the questions are fairly specific, as I mentioned earlier, for a lot of them. There's also what's called I think it's called the common letter of reference, or the name might be different, where it's like just an open-ended statement. And then a lot of the other schools that I mentioned talk about sort of comparing you to the peer set, and then sort of constructive criticism. Obviously, the constructive criticism is anecdotally focused, and for that question, you want your recommenders to talk about what the situation was, how you responded to the feedback, and sort of what you learned, or how maybe you took that feedback in a subsequent action or event. So that one's kind of specific. For the first question, I think you need to almost hope or strongly encourage your recommenders to talk about you sort of standing out relative to the peer set. I mean, it would be a little weak if your recommender said, well, this person's fine, they're sort of middle of the pack. Obviously, that's not what the schools are looking for. So you kind of have to find someone who truly believes that you are special in your capacity working for them or working alongside them. And then taking it one step further, it really depends on sort of, I think, what the school may be known for. And a lot of people are aware of this. So, for example, HBS really values leadership. Wharton really puts an emphasis on technical capability, specifically on the quant side, just given their finance leanings, or at least historically. Stanford might be about creativity or entrepreneurship. Booth is kind of like Wharton. MIT is on the technical side. So, I think it's nice. It would be nice if your recommenders could cater their letters to fit those criteria, but that's not necessary. Most importantly, it's, did you take responsibility? Did you lead? Do you have results? Are you also a generally good person to be around? I think if you can check those boxes, you should be in pretty good shape, on top of maybe, that je ne sais quoi that your recommender can identify. You should have a good conversation with your recommenders about what you think your strengths are. They may use them or they may not, but at least you've put it out there. You can't force the hand entirely. Well, great. We have another question here, which is, who would be a good recommendation option for someone who owns his own business or fund? Great question. This actually gets talked about a lot by people on the admissions committees at various schools. So, you have a little bit more flexibility here, just given the issues. So you may talk. You probably don't want to get a subordinate, or someone who reports to you writing for you. That might seem like a conflict of interest, but you could potentially get a client, or a customer. Maybe partner, either internal or external to your organization. I think that would be a good way for someone to speak to. They see this the schools see this all the time, so it's not a negative in any way. You just have to be, I think, a little creative and honest with them about what them as in the recommenders, in terms of what this process entails and how they should be describing your accomplishments and your relative worth. This question reads, in an optional essay, is it okay to address two possible concerns, such as low GPA the first few semesters of school, and using a letter of recommendation other than your current employer? Yeah, that's fine. Word counts or word limits do come into play here. Keep it brief, obviously, to get it under. But yeah, that's no problem. I've worked with candidates who have had a couple of issues they want to address. In fact, I've seen the two that you've mentioned, and they get them done. Just be brief. There's no need to drag it out. I think for the low GPA, just address. You want to have a counter as to maybe how you've overcome that since that low GPA in the beginning of school, and maybe why you think you'll be able to handle the rigors of the MBA program. For the letter of recommendation, that can be very simply stated as something like, my current employer is, I'm not in the position to ask them, or the policy is they don't provide recommendations, and just leave it at that, right? Save more space for the first question or first matter. Oh, great. Do we have any other questions? I know we have a minute left or so. Okay, great. Well, I don't see any other questions here. So, like I said, it's been a real pleasure presenting to all of you and answering your questions. If you have any other questions, or you want to talk further, there are two great ways to get in touch with us at Admissionado. The first way is on the GMAT Club board, as I mentioned, specifically on our channel. We respond very, very quickly and as accurately as we can. We're not going to obviously give tremendous posts, because we want to be cognizant of our staff's time. But the other way to do it is to just sign up on our page, admissionado.com, and there should be a link in the right, or a button or a click on the top right corner, and that'll help you get in touch with a free consultation. Those are a great way for people who are applying for round 1 or even round 2 or both to talk to someone that they could work with, and for us to give you an opportunity to kind of explain, what our services are about, and how we can be helpful. That's basically it. And to everyone who is applying this year or in subsequent years, good luck. It's a tough process, but the process itself of applying is actually quite nice. It's introspective, and most people I talk to quite enjoy it because they find it to be one of sort of the last opportunities to sort of really self-reflect in a formal capacity. So hopefully it works out for all of you, and please be in touch. And again, best of luck.